It is a newly scored soundtrack that brings the film new life and a new perspective. The musical score was composed in 2012 by Paul Miller, who is also known as DJ Spooky, that subliminal kid. And we are very pleased that Paul is with us this afternoon to introduce this film and to speak of his understanding of Dovzhenko's cinematic genius. A bit about Paul. He is a native of Washington, D.C. He is an electronic and experimental hip-hop musician. He is a turntablist, a producer, a philosopher, and an author. Paul is also a professor of music-mediated art at the European Graduate School and is the executive editor of Origin magazine. In 2008, Paul released his book, Sound Unbound, Sampling Digital Music and Culture, which is about the remix, how music, art, and literature have blurred the lines between what an artist can do and what a composer can create. In the book, Paul asks artists to describe their work and compositional strategies in their own words, and the book serves as a report from the front lines on the role of sound and digital media in an information-based society. More recently, in 2011, Paul released a graphic design project focused on the impact of climate change on Antarctica, but through the prism of digital media and contemporary music compositions. The project, it explores the idea of acoustic portraits of Antarctica and includes the book entitled The Book of Ice. In 2012, Paul was selected as the first artist in residence at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, just down the street here, where for a year he composed and performed new soundtracks for films and video compositions. So we have the great honor to have Paul with us today, and I'm going to ask him to come to the podium, say a few introductory words about himself, and also about Dovzhenko's film Earth, which then you will watch. Thank you.
First and foremost, I just want to say thank you to Andrew. It's been a real pleasure corresponding with him over the we've been trying to figure this out for almost 2 years. I want to show you a quick clip of a project. I'm very interested in Eastern Europe and specifically the post-Soviet realm, precisely because it's a place where these kinds of radical uncertainties of the near future have been manifesting. The crisis of, for me at least as an artist, of after 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a whole sense that you weren't sure where the world was going, because we now live in a quote-unquote multipolar world. The Cold War really shaped and molded the 20th century, and now with the 21st, we still see the fragments of that sort of hidden conflict as a dimension of politics, as a dimension of art, and a dimension of how literature and almost all aspects of modern life respond to the uncertainty of our time. So I got asked to present a project at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, but I've also DJ'd in Ukraine as part of a film project by Ilya Karnazovsky. I'm not sure. Karnazovsky, okay. And it was outside of Kharkiv. That was an interesting situation because what ended up happening is the filmmaker took over a hidden science city. And essentially Stalin created these hidden cities where research was conducted, mainly on nuclear and other kinds of weapons. So I got asked to DJ. They had me, Marina Abramovich, and Peaches do a kind of DJ battle in this crazy science town. So that's one project, but this one was a remix of a Ukrainian filmmaker, Zyga Vertov, Michael Kaufman, that we presented at the Hermitage. And I just wanted to play you a quick clip. We don't even need to let it play all the way through, but just about maybe a minute, if you can just hit play. Parts of Eastern Europe. But the underlying premise here was the Hermitage. This is the first time they had electronic music at such a high culture kind of place. So going from there, I've also been to other kinds of really interesting parts of thinking about collage. And that's where me and Vitaly are going to be talking about that after the film. So Dovzhenko, to me, and him and Vertov are two of the filmmakers that I think really understand this idea of montage. So what you're going to be seeing today is an original print that we did a high definition transfer. I rescored the film with electronic music, looking at this idea of dialectical montage, which was a very specific movement in Soviet era early cinema. But at the same time that movement was happening, the Russians were inviting a lot of African American poets and artists to come to Russia, like Paul Robeson, Claude McKay, and others. So, interestingly enough, this idea that there was a cosmopolitan beginning of Russian and Ukrainian cinema, to me is very intriguing for a 21st century. So that's what you're going to be seeing. And then we'll have a conversation afterwards about this idea of the cosmopolitan urge in Eastern Europe, especially with digital media. So I guess, is that, should we press play?
That's good.
Okay, so thanks.
So stepping back to put Earth a little bit into the context of Soviet cinema at the time, indeed we can speak that in the 1920s a different approach to filmmaking was developed in the countries of the Soviet Union. There were several approaches and there were several theoreticians. What united them is a desire to figure out what is uniquely cinematic about cinema. What is the cinematicness of this new art form that emerged? How is it unique, and how can we best incorporate the unique opportunities it's offering into our creative projects? So, arguably, the earliest developer of a school of montage was Lev Kuleshov. Many of us who study cinema have heard of the Kuleshov effect. And Kuleshov's idea is how a meaning is born through juxtaposition. He basically figured out, in the theoretical sense, the most basic understanding of how montage works. And he worked then to develop a theory, a how-to. And his understanding that was later developed by Vsevolod Pudovkin is of montage as a brick by brick. So in other words, you're putting brick to brick and you're creating a whole structure. In difference from them, Sergei Eisenstein developed his vision of montage as something that emphasizes clash and conflict. Eisensteinian montage wants to evoke in us strong visceral reactions, from his very first full-length feature film Strike and onwards to Battleship Potemkin in October and later works. Some outside critics compared these two filmmakers and their approaches to different forms of music. And they said that the Kuleshov and Pudovkin montage is like a song, and Eisensteinian montage is like a shout, a scream, which really makes us confront things. By contrast, Dziga Vertov is very much somebody who wants us to involve in the intellectual, rational co-creation of meaning, and he thinks of us as intellectual processors of the information, and he wants to challenge us intellectually. So there were those three approaches that were developed, and then out of nowhere came the fourth one, which shocked even Dovzhenko and Pudovkin, shocked even Eisenstein and Pudovkin and Vertov, and that was Alexander Dovzhenko. Dovzhenko's montage is different in that Dovzhenko wants us to be appreciative of open-endedness of his things. He wants us to be active thinkers and active feelers. He wants us to create an emotion, a range of emotions, but he does not direct us the way Eisenstein tries to direct us towards one very specific emotion. He wants us to have a mix of emotions, a range of emotions. Also, even though all of Soviet montage cinema of the 1920s is associated with fast cutting, Dovzhenko actually is the slowest of the fast cutters. He pauses, his camera focuses on a shot where something can happen that is very, very minimal. Dovzhenko was the only great filmmaker of the so-called heroic era of Soviet cinema who came from painting, from another visual art form. And there have been scholars who thought that the best way to approach Dovzhenko's cinema as to think of it as visual poetry. In other words, he is somebody who is creating assemblages of self-sustained but also deeply linked visual images. And his approach has been compared to the tradition of muralists, the innovative art painters of the Bolshuk school in Ukraine, and to people like Diego Rivera and David Siqueiros in Mexico. So Dovzhenko, in his cinematic innovation, has these unique and unprecedented linkages that are only beginning to be further explored and understood by filmmakers. Also, another thing that I hope you have noticed is that this is a utopian film. It's the film that is a dream. The whole sequence of the harvest, of the agricultural cycle, from plowing the land to sowing the seed, to harvesting the seed, for processing grain and making bread, happens in a short dream. But we don't know whose dream is it. It's a collective dream. And we see throughout the film people looking outside, entranced, enchantment. They're looking at something outside the frame, and we're not sure what it is. And it is his way of representing that collective dream. It is a utopian film that makes us want to value life. And despite the tragedy of the main character, and despite the focus on a specific traumatic transitional point in Ukrainian and more broadly Soviet history, it's a film about the cycle of life, about eternal return, about death and rebirth, and about oneness, about the kind of spirituality which is not necessarily manifested in organized religion, but in being one with our planet Earth. So Earth here becomes Earth not only in the sense of land underneath our feet, but being in balance, being in communion with all the biosphere of our planet. So perhaps we would also, in this sense, link Dovzhenko with a great Ukrainian scholar and the founder of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, Vitaly Chernetsky, who invented the concept of the biosphere. So, in other words, what I'd like to emphasize is we have here a unique artist who shares a lot of features, a lot of concerns, a lot of theoretical and intellectual awareness with other great directors of the so-called heroic age of Soviet cinema, but also has his unique, specific vision. And I'm delighted that Paul Miller, DJ Spooky, has produced the score that also to me is very much a dreamy score that helps us get into this dreamlike meditative stance. And therefore I would like now to invite Paul to say a few words about his approach to create the score for this film, which is quite unique in the history of world cinema. And hopefully from this we will then build on our dialogue as it goes on.
Thanks. The fun part about a film is that you have to remember at that time there was a very dynamic tension between representation of realism and this idea that magic and cinema opening up new spaces in the culture. So in the 1900s, at the beginning of film, if people saw a train coming out of the screen, everyone would get up and run, because they actually felt that the train would kind of have an impact. So you have to imagine at that time, film was a very powerful medium, And two of my favorite filmmakers from a non-Eastern European context are Méliès, who's considered to be the first major filmmaker to come up with special effects. Méliès, and then you have the Lumière brothers who were thinking about realism. So that's in the West. But around 1915, D.W. Griffith came up with this idea of Birth of a Nation, which set the tone for Hollywood. So if you were in Russia and if you were in Eastern Europe, you have to imagine they were, Eisenstein and all those guys were looking at American film. You had Charlie Chaplin later on. There was a whole series of cross-cultural initiatives. So the epic, the idea of an epic film, really, I think, set the tone for this time because everyone was trying to figure out after the revolution. So when I was making the score, I was thinking about folk music because the original score for the movie by, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, the soundtrack, it kind of incorporated Ukrainian and Russian folk music. For me, I wanted to go to contemporary global folk music, which is electronic music. So you have to imagine many kids around the world are listening to hip-hop, techno. In Russia, there's a big style of hip-hop, same as Ukraine. Let's say, for example, there's a couple really interesting Ukrainian and Russian hip-hop DJs who I think are doing some great work. But at the same time, you have to imagine electronic music is this kind of subtle repetition. And so that is part of the score from the viewpoint of let's think about these places as expanded cinema and think about if you were in a new time, our new era is multimedia. So we have to think of electronic music and this idea of dialectical montage as the first VJ culture. So these guys were very original and very innovative. And if you also think about the tradition of the avant-garde at that time, you had Scriabin as a composer who was very influential. You had Kandinsky who was thinking about sound and image. So the avant-garde at that time was trying to figure out these new technologies. So the composers and the artists and the painters and sculptors after the revolution, everyone was trying to figure out a new voice, a new style. And that was what, to me at least, from the 21st century point of view, looking back, we're now in an era where capitalism seems to have kind of dominated the global discourse. Even if you're in China, which is supposedly communist, the hyper-capitalist, in the realm of colonialism and now post-colonialism, Ukraine is kind of an interesting emblem of all these wars and occupations that have crossed through Central Europe. You know, Poland, Ukraine, the Prussians. So for me as a composer, from an American point of view, the funny thing is, World War II, all of the main leaders that came out of this problem, the war, Hitler, Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Stalin, they were all painters. So if you ever see Stalin's sketches, for example, or Hitler, he was a watercolor painter. Imagine if they just let him into art school, we wouldn't have had the war. You have to imagine at that time in the 20s, the era was very unstable. Germany had been defeated. They were paying reparations, so there was a kind of nationalism. The economy of the world was in this kind of strange upheaval because the American economy was going really well, but Europe was in depression. And then, so what was the future? What did people think was the future? So that's where this kind of film was showing an alternative past, an alternative vision. And that's where I think it's very, it's kind of utopian in a funny way. Like they're dreaming of a tractor and just being able to make some food, and the wealthy people, the murder, the guy at the end says, I killed him, and the town people are ignoring him, and the other guy is making an announcement that the communists will bring an airplane and everyone's looking up. Very simple, but very powerful.
Thank you. So, do we have questions from the audience to open things up? Yes, sir.
In light of what you said about the choice of music, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit of your choice to finish with was it Bach or just your music?
Well, the fugue. The fugue is a kind of an interesting emblem in Western culture because the fugue represents the loss of time. It's actually psychological as well. There's Sigmund Freud wrote a series of essays about the fugue, listening to it, and Bach also is very mathematical. So to me, it's kind of an interesting appropriation. And so the fun part about scoring a film is you can take motifs and elements from different styles. Film soundtrack is very open, and it's meant to be kind of evoking different emotions, different trajectory of a story. So when you think about, in our era of YouTube and the idea of the mashup and the remix, this idea is now part of the basic vocabulary. If you hear one style of music but you see a different style of image, it creates this kind of dynamic uncertainty. So I felt that Bach actually is this kind of very complex motifs. They're very similar to electronic music, but also open the whole narrative up. I was thinking of ending it with either Prokofiev or, but it felt a little bit too heavy. And I felt that Bach had this kind of complexity. By the way, it's sampled. I don't know if you were hearing the edits and stuff. So I was editing and changing it around. It's not the way you play it normally. So it ends when the film ends and things like that. But the idea for soundtrack, always, I'll give you one of my favorite moments is Das Spoke Zarathustra at the beginning of 2001, A Space Odyssey. That's kind of. Those are certain moments where film really is very powerful, but the soundtrack helps amplify.
Riffing off of that a little bit, this film, of course, comes at a very crucial transition moment. Yesterday, we saw Together's Enthusiasm, which was the first sound film made in Ukraine. Earth is one of the last silent films made in Ukraine, and generally within the Soviet Union, those innovative filmmakers like Dovzhenko, like Verkov, Eisenstein, Budovkin, and others were very actively thinking about the role that sound plays in cinema. There is a famous collective statement on sound by Soviet filmmakers, and they felt that sound should not be just something that happens and that is passively incorporated, but needs to add an extra dimension to montage. They talked about contrapuntal use of sound, for example, which was the pictures. As you were developing this score, were you trying to pay attention to some of these ideas that the Soviet filmmakers of the late 1920s were thinking about the use of sound?
Absolutely. I mean, the fun part about the Soviet as an American, it's kind of it's this crazy idea that somehow haunted most of the 20th century. And growing up in Washington, D.C., which is, federal capital, all this kind of stuff, I remember the Soviet embassy, or the Russian embassy, was on Wisconsin Avenue. And occasionally they would have receptions, and they would try and encourage people to listen to Russian and Eastern European music. Meanwhile, the Americans, we had people, they would tour stuff like the State Department and with Jackson Pollock, or there was always this tension between visual arts, between the Soviets and the American system. But for music and poetry, I was very influenced by Vladimir Plotnikov and some of his ideas of mathematics and poetry. But algorithms and the way we think about electronic music, amusingly enough, the Soviet scene was quite advanced with science. So they were experimenting with new instruments like the theremin. There's a gentleman, Leonid Theremin, and that approach to always having an innovation with instruments and trying new approaches was specifically at the beginning of the revolution. Obviously later, people got killed, etc., and the system became more conservative. But at the beginning, it was almost like anything goes, and that's where I very much was very interested in early Soviet science fiction as well, like Yevgeny Zamyatin's book We, or Boris and Arkady Strugatsky later on, or even other Soviet science fiction writers like Stanislav Lem from Poland. So this, to me, is kind of an uncertain soundtrack.
Thank you so much. Perhaps we have more questions or comments from the audience. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I actually find it a little bit disturbing how the movie that is so rich and so full and dramatic stories and lots of conflicts that you just kind of with a white brush and paint over it with some cliche hip-hop samples from '95, and you turn it into kind of background wallpaper DJ set.
Okay. Let me respond to that. A cliche is a French term for meaning a clamp. It's something that holds together elements. So if you're looking at montage, you're seeing a collage, you're seeing elements being put in juxtaposition. It's an assemblage. So you're welcome to your opinion. I don't care about that so much. So hip-hop in New York has a very specific relationship to new culture and has always been something that's been about innovation. So the juxtaposition of electronic music and this film, instead of going for what people would do in an obvious way, which would be to just have folk music and the normal kind of soundtrack, I wanted to try something different. So as an artist, it's my statement. So if you want to try your version, no problem.
Right? I think there's a man in the back. Yes, sir. Yes, you.
Yeah, if you can ask Dovzhenko a question, what question would you ask, or what would the dialogue be? Either gentleman.
Let's you know, I want to ask you about the avant-garde, because at that time it was about cosmopolitanism. They really wanted to show this could happen anywhere, and they wanted to try and support indigenous people, and they wanted to show they had everything from Donbass, the world revolution, and this kind of thing. How did that create the beginning of the globalist idea of culture? So that's what I'd like to maybe talk about.
Okay, so I now have a little bit of a stereo effect here, which I think is potentially quite creative. In the case of Dovzhenko, he is actually, going to your question first and then going to Paul's development, we do not have his theoretical statements on cinema, in difference from Kuleshov and Pudovkin and Eisenstein and Vertov. From Dovzhenko, we only have one theoretical article from the 1920s, and it's on painting. It's a very interesting article from 1926, from right at the beginning of his career. So, at the time when he's making his most challenging, his most innovative work, we do not have the access to his thought processes. He later starts his famous diary, and in fact, in the 40s and the 50s, he also writes fiction. So we have a lot of documentation of his later thought, of his resistance against the Stalinist regime, of his determination to survive as an independent, critically thinking individual. But paradoxically, at that most pivotal moment in his career, we have very little record of his thought process. How did he come up with some of these images? And indeed, moving now to Paul's question/comment on globalization, this is very much a process of which Dovzhenko was a part. We have to remember that he started his professional training as a visual artist in Germany, in Weimar, Germany, in the early 1920s. It is also where he developed his strong taste for cinema. So he was an avid film goer, and he was a student of painting in Germany when Expressionism and Bauhaus and all sorts of other things were happening. So this peasant lad from Chernigivщина was all of a sudden in the midst of the most cutting-edge innovation across the arts. And he was absorbing it very rapidly, but also trying to create it into something that is all his own. And to me, his three great silent films, his famous silent trilogies, Venehora, Arsenal, and Zemlyak, they are full to bursting with attempts, with experiments of showing what one could do with cinema and what others have not done. And he's not doing it through manifestos, he's actually doing it through practical filmmaking work. And that is fascinating, but that is also enigmatic. And yes, in terms of developing global links, this is a part of the thinking that Dovzhenko shares with his friends from Vaplite, the leading literary group of Ukraine of the mid-1920s, of which he was the only non-writer member. And this organization, the Free Academy of Proletarian Literature, was a group that indeed was trying to think of decentering and reorganizing the world. They were trying to think of linkages of new ways of revolutionary transformation, and indeed this is where Ukraine stands perhaps unique in its region, because even not in Dovzhenko, but going as far back as Taras Shevchenko in the 1840s with his poem Kavkaz, we start the development of anti-colonial solidarity of the oppressed across racial, linguistic, religious, and other divides, of the unity of that kind. And with Dovzhenko, while his work is very specifically anchored on Ukrainian experiences, this is the kind of liberational, anti-colonial, post-colonial national revival that we would later see in the works of such great theorists of post-colonialism as Franz Fanon in the 1960s. So my claim would be that in Ukrainian culture, in what Shevchenko did in the 40s, the 1840s, and what Dovzhenko is doing in the late 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, we see hitting that moment of global resonance, global relevance that could have reverberated so strongly, and that was picked up later by others, but in the Ukraine's case remained a bit hidden and not yet fully appreciated, but it is beginning to transform. The fact that there we have a major rediscovery of classics of silent cinema, that these films are being shown now with new scores, not only Dovzhenko's Earth, but many others. Paul has worked on other films from the Soviet 1920s, and we've seen on Friday night another film, Kaufman's in the Spring, with a new score. We see how people are now figuring out the relevance. People are building bridges across times and across spaces. So we have this new situation of cognitive mapping and building alliances, of being together in new forms of belonging. And this is actually ties in with Euromaidan. And stay with me here. I think this is actually relevant in that what we see here is a potentiality for building a new type of community. And this is something that has fascinated a lot of contemporary theorists. I'm thinking of people like Maurice Blanchot, I'm thinking of people like Giorgio Agamben, about what kind of community comes out of new forms of global social protest. From 1968 in Paris and Prague, from 1989 in Tiananmen Square, from events in Kiev, from the hunger strike in the early 90s to the Orange Revolution to Euromaidan. We see a new way of people coming together and being in common and developing these kind of communities. And these communities are developed sometimes across the stereotypical boundaries that we thought would be dividing us. So this new potentialities of being in common, being together, I think is what we saw the diverse works that we've seen over the past 3 days are trying to encourage us to develop. And I think the fact that we have Paul here with his contribution is showing how this Ukrainian participation in this project is reverberating, and it's finding its relevance not only for the Ukrainian audience, but very much outside it as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, I think a lot of Americans wouldn't know that Chernetsky, for example, the biosphere concept was Ukrainian, or for that matter, a lot of the early computing and stuff like that, and linguistics and so on. Kharkov is a very important center for education. When I first went to Kharkov, it was pretty amazing because I was taken to a secret science research base that was had been commissioned by Stalin and didn't exist on any maps. And the film director, kind of Chernetsky.
Yes, it's very hard. Chrzanowski. Again, he's actually, the last name is Polish. Chrzanowski, which means of the horseradish. Chrzan, it's cream.
So he wanted me and Peaches. I don't know if everyone knows Peaches, but me and her were supposed to have a DJ battle in this science city. and he wouldn't let people leave the film set, and the film was supposed to keep going. Do you know this story? It's a crazy, weird film. Yeah. And he couldn't finish the film because it just kept going. And he wanted us to stay in the science, because I guess during the time of the Soviet era, you weren't allowed to leave. And the director of the Science City was doing experiments, like psychological experiments on the people in the town. So the director wanted to encourage us to experience that. And we all said, we'll stay in the hotel nearby. But it was pretty interesting from the viewpoint of how much coercion, where it's obvious. If you look at other parts of Eastern Europe, like the Stasi in Germany. Now, of course, in the US, we have the NSA, the revelations of Snowden, and now the post-Snowden era. One of the things that really intrigued me about the beginning of this kind of film form was the fact that dialectics, it was very philosophical oriented. If you think about the 1920s at that time, film was so powerful. I mean, they didn't really even have normal theaters. They had to carry it around. Vertov and all his crowd would have to actually carry the projectors. They would set up, project, have a kind of almost a revival, kind of scenario. In the U.S. at that time, film was booming, and Hollywood was being born with all these kind of epic blockbusters. Of course, Birth of a Nation really set the tone. So silent film versus sound. It's still a very interesting moment because multimedia and the music video have inherited. Like if you see these sort of dreamy montage stuff, you can easily think of videos like by Bjork, or you can think of a lot of art students like David Bowie, and everyone looked at early Soviet stuff because that was it was a very fresh kind of point of view because we've been so bombarded with Hollywood stuff. So that's where I think undercurrent, but people aren't aware of it as much as they could be.
Thank you so much. Do we have more questions from the audience? All right, this moment, since this has been a long 3 days, I would like to... Okay, one more thing before I wrap up.
By the way, I'm very important about open source media, so everything you're hearing, including elements of the film, are released under Creative Commons out of Harvard's Berkeley Law Center. So Creative Commons encourages sampling and remix. So because the film is very old, all the elements are out of normal copyright. So I want to encourage people to, like the gentleman mentioned earlier, he has his own point of view about sound. The idea is that it's open source, anyone can remix, sample, transform. There's a version on my website at djspooky.com. There's also one at the Ukrainian Film Institute, if I remember correctly. So they're encouraging people to rescore. I might be misremembering the actual title of the Ukrainian film. Luba, do you remember the name of how do you? Oh, okay. But it's online, and feel free to remix. So